Warm welcome to today's talk. My guest today is Rob Goodman, who is the author of a book called Rome's Last Citizen, which is all about Cato the Younger, the entire life history of this person, as well as kind of the fall of the Roman Republic. It's fantastic. It is incredible. And what we talk about in this podcast is a lot about Cato the Younger, which is one of the most famous, Cato the Stoic, who is known for his virtue and living a good life. As well, Rob has just released a book called Words on Fire, which is all about political rhetoric and speaking with eloquence and how to do such a thing. And I haven't finished that book yet, but from what I'm reading, it's pretty good. It's all about one of the main characters is Cicero, who was a contemporary of Cato, a very interesting guy as well. And we talked about a lot of cool stuff in this podcast, and I hope you enjoy it. Essentially, I don't know how your book ended up in my Amazon cart, but yeah, I was just looking through what I had in my cart, and I saw it there, and I was like, I've heard this name Cato the Younger quite a bit, and I don't know anything about him, so I'll just buy this book. And then just complete surprise, like completely blown away by it. And
thank you.
I just couldn't believe the life that this guy lived, and the way, like, it was so long ago, and we have, like, you managed pretty much like day-to-day details of this guy. I don't know, I guess I was kind of caught off guard by just how much detail we actually have of this time period.
Yeah. So it's interesting. When I was trying to remember how we wrote the story of Cato and what kind of research we were using, one thing that we really relied on is Plutarch's biography of Cato. So Plutarch lived a couple hundred years after Cato, and he was a Greek, but I believe he was a Roman citizen, but he was a kind of elite figure in the Roman Empire, although he was from Greece and not from Rome. But he wrote this series of parallel lives of Roman and Greek statesmen, people like Julius Caesar and Cato, and also Demosthenes and other important figures from Greek history, to kind of talk about the comparisons and contrasts between the different cultures, is kind of part of the project of figuring out where Greece belonged in this Roman Empire that kind of thought of itself as sort of the center of culture, but also was in this politically subordinate role. And he was trying to figure out some lessons that could be learned from comparing the histories of the two cultures up to that point. So anyway, Plutarch is our main source for what we know about Cato. And he wrote this kind of, it's a bit of a mythologizing biography where, it's not exactly a 100% faithful record because he's writing a couple hundred years after the fact. But the cool thing is that people who have studied Plutarch really closely have been able to reconstruct that a lot of his sources were people that were a lot closer to Cato in time and either, witnessed some of these events or were a lot closer in time to people who did. But the other really cool source that we have that kind of helps us reconstruct this on a day-to-day basis is Cicero, who was, Cato's a sort of political frenemy at times. So Cicero left these speeches that kind of give you a sense of the day-to-day politics in the Roman courts and in the Roman Senate, and you've got a couple of dozens of those, several dozen. But on top of that, and this is the best resource, I think, for people studying this period, he left all these letters, hundreds of letters, especially to his friend Atticus, who's living in Greece, but also letters to his brother, to his friends, to other political figures, and even one to Cato. We have Cato's response to. And this really helps you put together the day-to-day politics of this period. Obviously, it's not, it's a record of the elite politics. It's not telling you what kind of ordinary, laborers were doing, what slaves were doing, but it is kind of telling you what it would have been like to experience this political turmoil from a position in the elite. And the really cool thing is that because it's really well documented, I think something that Mary Beard, who's a classicist who's written about ancient Rome, has said is that one of the cool things about studying this period is you can basically read everything there is to read about this period. Like there's a lot of written sources, but it's not so much that it's overwhelming, like it would be to study 1900s France or something. You could, as a single human being, read everything there is to read that we have explaining the day-to-day politics of this period. And, my co-author and I didn't actually do that. We didn't read everything like a professional classicist would, but we got enough, I think, to really be able to reconstruct some of these pivotal moments. And it's really cool that we're lucky this is one of the first periods in Western history where that kind of record exists, which is part of the reason why there's so much interest in and writing about that period.
Yeah, as well. On top of that, I was listening to some hardcore history. I'm sure you know
Oh
that
yeah.
podcast. Yeah. So I listened to Death Throes of the Republic, where it talked about that same period. And then
Yeah.
I was just thinking about hardcore history. He has one on Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, and that was actually 1,200 years after these events, and there's just so little documentation.
Right.
And everyone's like, we don't know when Genghis Khan was born. We don't know where he was the first 20 years. He just kind of popped up, you know? And
Right.
so it was very interesting seeing like in detail all this stuff about Cato, all this stuff about all these different these Roman elite and how much information we have on it.
Yeah, and it was, we're lucky that it was a literate culture, and we're also lucky that, in addition to people like Cicero writing those letters, there was a lot of enslaved labor that was doing things like taking dictation, copying them, distributing them, reading them out loud when they got to the other location. So there's a whole economy of people involved in the writing and production and distribution of these texts, and then later on the copying of them. And so we have them to thank for the fact that there's so much of a record. And then later on, of course, when these things are rediscovered in early modern Europe, and scholars are able to put together this record, because there were copies of Cicero's letters laying in some kind of monastery in the middle of Italy, that people were able to rediscover them in the early part of the Renaissance, and then start studying them in earnest. So we're lucky that we have as much as we have for that window in time. It's not everything, but for any kind of given period in ancient history, it is kind of remarkable that there's that much.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different books and things that I'm just listening to Lives of the Stoics as well
Oh yeah.
right now. And you actually, Ryan Holiday mentions you in that book in the Cato the Younger
Oh yeah.
section of it. But yeah, he talks about these people wrote all these books and then they're gone, and then
Right.
this person wrote all these books and then they're gone. It's quite unfortunate how much knowledge that we've lost over the years of pretty much everything.
It's remarkable. Like, so if there was one thing that I wish I could kind of conjure a source into existence, like I think everyone who studies ancient history kind of wishes there's a one source that exists but no one's ever found, is that I believe Julius Caesar wrote a book called, Cicero first wrote a book about Cato, just called Cato, kind of glorifying and celebrating Cato after his suicide, talking about him as an example for Roman politics, in a pretty brave act, because Cato had been on the losing side of the Civil War, and Caesar's side was now in charge. So for Cicero to do that took a little bit of political courage, and I would have loved to read it. And then Caesar comes back and writes an anti-Cato in response to what Cicero said. And again, both these things are lost, but it would have been so cool to see this kind of debate on his example and his role in Roman politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things as well that I was curious about in terms of Cato, throughout the entire book, everyone says, we can't all be Catos based on both Cato the Elder and Cato the Younger. I believe that saying kind of came from both of them. But what does, I guess it's kind of, I understand that Cato he was sort of incorruptible. You couldn't buy his vote or anything like that. He walked barefoot. He didn't wear fancy clothes. What other kind of, I guess, what kind of behaviors would he have to be held in such high regard by everyone, like during his lifetime?
Well, some of these, it started early when he was, he had a military role, and part of the kind of typical Roman career was that if you were, a member of the Roman elite and you wanted to ascend to political office, you'd spend time kind of as a political officer in the army. So you do some leadership and some fighting. You wouldn't necessarily be down in the trenches, but you'd have some experience leading troops or serving some kind of administrative role. Even Cicero, who was not kind of a military person at all, spent some time doing that. So Cato did this at a young age as a military tribune. And people sort of noticed at an early age that he was committed to these austere and stoic ideas of sort of disdaining personal comfort and trying to subject himself to the harshest possible circumstances. So he would, for instance, when it was typical for an officer to ride on horseback, he would walk on foot. And when it was typical for an officer to have better sleeping accommodations than his troops, he'd sleep on the ground wrapped up in a cloak like the regular troops would do. And that really endeared him to his men. Interestingly enough, there's a more recent biography of Cato that came out from a classicist, and he was talking specifically about not riding a horse. And he said this is kind of one of these cases in which Cato's self-image was valuable from the point of image cultivation, but not so much from the point of view of usefulness, what he's trying to do. The reason that officers are on horseback is not always because they need more comfort and they're more comfortable. It's because it gives them a better vantage point to see what's going on, and they can move up and down the lines faster to communicate with the troops and the subordinate officers. So it's one of these cases in which Cato seemed like he was willing to take a hit to his effectiveness in order to stick to his ideals and his self-image as someone who didn't care about these petty sort of comforts. And that's really a good image for many of the other things he did in his career. This utterly uncompromising streak that nevertheless prevented him from being as politically effective as he might have been. And that's sort of why he's such an interesting figure to my co-author Jimmy and I, is that he really puts this question in really high relief, this question of how useful is principle in politics? When does support for principle turn into harming your own cause? Max Weber, who's a German political and economic thinker, gave a great lecture on this. He talked about the ethic of responsibility and the ethic of ultimate ends. And I think what he meant by that is oftentimes in politics, there's the ethic of ultimate ends is sort of this idea of doing what is right, period, regardless of what it gets you, because your ultimate ends are good, because you're pure at heart, or because you support a pure set of ideals. And the ethic of responsibility is figuring out what the consequences of your actions are going to be and working backwards from there. And I think he says, ideally, to be great in politics, you should be able to combine both of these. You should be able to know which one, when it is time for one and when it is time for the other. But that's really difficult in practice. And I think Cato was someone who very much was on the side of the ethic of ultimate ends. Was I'm going to follow my principles and ideals, damn the consequences. Or in the famous Roman quote that I don't think was said by Cato, but was kind of associated with him because it kind of stands in for his worldview. It was let justice be done even though the heavens fall, and that's very much what he was willing to put up with, provided that he was on what he considered the right side.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the very frustrating things reading about his life. There's just so many situations where it's kind of blatantly obvious. Maybe it's because it's in hindsight, but yeah, like for example, when he doesn't accept Pompey's hand in marriage to marry off his daughter to him, and then all of this, even when they were on the brink of civil war, and then he kind of forced it to happen. Like, even though Pompey was willing to kind of compromise with Caesar at the time, it sort of just seems frustrating that it seems like at the very key moments where it's cool in day to day, great that he's able to stick to his principles, but then he can't turn it off when it would, like, it's just doing a lot more damage than it just kind of submitting a little bit would have done.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And he was someone who didn't really, either didn't consider the consequences of his actions for the Republic, or just considered himself so far above consequences that it just didn't really enter into his calculation. The other way of looking at him is someone who was, in a way, a very canny and effective politician when it came to cultivating his image, when it came to kind of identifying himself with mos maiorum, the way of the ancients, the way of the ancestors, which was sort of Rome's idea of ancestral custom and the way things had always been done. Even though that's sort of in all societies, there's a kind of a combination of truth and fiction in figuring out the way things have always been done. Cato was really effective in cultivating this idea that he was the person who embodied this set of ancestral customs. But again, not so effective in seeing that they were perpetuated through time, because they didn't exist just for themselves. They were supposed to exist for the stability of the Republic. And he was someone who didn't really think best about how to preserve that in a kind of rigorous way.
Yeah, and so this image that he cultivated, do you think that was all like he sat there thinking, how will I cultivate, what would this virtuous person act like? Do you think he made a conscious effort to shape how he was perceived?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's hard to tell. It's hard to be inside his mind because we don't have a lot that comes from him directly. We just have other people looking at him from the outside and trying to put together his motives. One thing I mentioned is, the sources. There's only one thing that Cato wrote, and it's this letter to Cicero. It's a very kind of stiff and formal letter about about Cicero's application to get a triumph for his military success he had. And Cato's response was that this wasn't impressive enough to deserve a triumph, and so on. So it's really hard to figure out, to what extent is this sincere commitment? To what extent is it deliberate kind of political image crafting? We don't really know, and I think it's kind of part of the responsibility of a biographer or a historian to be upfront about what you don't know. But also, when you're reconstructing to the extent you can, to think about that and to make kind of reasonable conjectures, but let your reader know that you're making those conjectures. So I guess in Cato's case, I think there's some kind of conjecture in the book about what he must have been thinking, but part of it is kind of shaped by my, learning from and being around and reading about politicians in our age who can't be that different from politicians at other times and places. And I think part of it is that people, I think they this distinction between what you believe sincerely and what you believe just because it benefits you politically, I think doesn't even exist for a lot of people. I think people kind of come to find their beliefs are shaped by what they think is politically valuable for them or for their cause. I don't think there are a lot of sort of conscious hypocrites in politics, at least in my experience. I think people really sincerely believe what they say they believe, even when those beliefs are wrong or bad, because I think people are very good at the kind of motivated reasoning that convinces you that what is useful to you is also the right and correct thing to do. So it doesn't mean that everyone in politics is a saint. I think it's far from that. I think it's just that people are very good at motivated reasoning of the kind that convinces them that the behavior that is aligned with their ends is also good and correct and right. And I imagine if Cato's anything like any politicians that we know of, that it was probably something like that for him.
Yeah. And one of the things, an example in kind of modern day that I noticed is I listened to the Candace Owens interview on Joe Rogan number of years ago. And yeah, so she pretty much is against climate change or doesn't think it exists and things like that. And Joe Rogan was saying, hey, you don't need to have an opinion if you don't know, and she's like, yeah, but like, for example, I didn't have an opinion on abortion before. And then I went back and I looked at it and then I came up with the exact thoughts along the Republican Party line, and like every single belief that she individually came up with was all based on what is the Republican Party's viewpoint, and it's kind of frustrating because I wish that I would like to know, what do you really think, because to be entirely right or entirely left doesn't seem plausible at all. So it's just been like, it was kind of frustrating to see that with Candace Owens.
Yeah, this is something that political scientists talk about a lot. It is about how how polarization happens around certain issues and how issues kind of cluster among political parties, and why there's no kind of intuitive reason why your belief on global warming should predict your belief on abortion or vice versa. But with the kind of political alignments we have, that's something that happens quite a lot, because that's kind of part of the pressure of a two-party system, part of the pressure of political polarization. And there's a lot of research on why that happens, and is it driven by elites? Is it driven by the media? Is it driven by the parties? But I certainly think that that's the thing that happens. And I think the point is that if you're kind of experiencing that from the inside, even though your beliefs are kind of lining up in a way that kind of makes political sense for you, I don't think you experience it as that. I don't think people want to experience their beliefs as is compromise or hypocrisy. I think they experience them as authentic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And another thought that I was having is Cato committing suicide. It just seemed like he kind of did the ultimate thing in place of his beliefs, kind of thing. But it seemed like what you talked about often in Rome's Last Citizen is Rome needed Cato, and when he went to go run for consul, he just didn't really put too much of an effort into it because it was below him.
Mhm.
And then him killing himself is sort of, if he was alive after Caesar was assassinated, what would that look like? Would he be sort of one of the top people to go to? And like, because Rome descended, from my understanding, into civil war for the next 2 decades after that, right? After
Mhm.
Caesar got assassinated.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, that's certainly the case. It's hard to say, what Roman politics would look like if Cato had still been around. Um, but yeah, I think that the point that you made earlier about that Rome needed Cato, it's not so much that Rome needed him personally or specifically. I think it's that Rome, if it was going to kind of avoid this period of political tumult and crisis, um, needed a better constitutional structure, and it needed kind of these conservative elites in the Senate, um, and the kind of political aristocracy, people like Cato, to understand that the forms of government that had existed up to a certain point in Roman history weren't going to be suitable for managing these political divisions, for managing controversies over land reform and redistribution, for managing an empire with tools that were eventually, originally built to govern a city-state. It was just, there needed to be a constitutional transformation, or some kind of reform, and it might have happened through some kind of reformist process that didn't result in bloodshed, but you would have needed a different kind of elite to shepherd that kind of process along. Instead, it took a lot of bloodshed until ultimately Octavian established a new constitutional order. But you could imagine an alternate past in which not just Cato, but the kind of the class that Cato represented and spoke for had been more willing to make changes. That could have been a different future, and at least in that context, could have led to less bloodshed. I think I wish I could remember the name of this of the author who had this thesis, but he talks about the development of democracy in countries in the 19th century, and he compares Britain and Germany specifically. He says one of the big differences is whether you have conservative elites and members of the aristocracy that are willing to accommodate demands for democracy and voting rights, or are going to go all out to preserve their prerogatives and privileges, which often lead to things like authoritarianism and repression. It's not like Rome was facing a choice between democracy or authoritarianism. I mean, that's not really the issue, but I think it's kind of a parallel in that a lot of the stability comes down to how far-sighted and accommodating is this conservative elite in power going to be. And I think if Cato is an example of someone who personally is, charismatic and compelling, but didn't really speak for a class or represent a class that was capable of making the accommodations that could have put Rome on a different path. At least that's my take on it after having written the book and thought about it for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and yeah, another thing as well. So I guess first of all, what's your opinion on Julius Caesar? You don't really go too in depth on kind of, I mean, the book's about Cato, so we don't go too in depth onto sort of what are the motivations between the other characters in the book. But yeah, I guess overall, do you think kind of Brutus was right to sort of organize this assassination on him, or do you think like just judging by the death throes of the Republic, the information on Caesar is pretty pretty kind of in depth, and it seemed kind of like he was maybe a good thing for Rome from that person, from me listening to it, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think in many ways that makes sense. I think the interesting thing about Caesar, I mean, we didn't write about him a lot because there's so much about him. We didn't kind of his story's been told in so many different ways. We didn't want to repeat that story. But one thing I learned about him, in the course of doing this and also working on my new book, was that he wasn't just he was famous as a military leader. He was just a all-around brilliant individual. He was supposed to have been one of the most eloquent orators in Rome. He was a scholar and a writer. He wrote this really interesting work on rhetoric and grammar that engages with Cicero's work on rhetoric. And you had time to do this while leading a military campaign, in the freezing winter in Gaul. So he's just sort of a remarkable person, but also someone who I think because of that was really perceived as threatening kind of by the elite. And again, in a different way than Cato, really wasn't good at playing well with others. And this sort of leads both to his success and to the reason why he was perceived as a threat. I think kind of the classic comparison is between Julius Caesar and his nephew Octavian. Octavian being someone who, perhaps not as personally brilliant in the same ways, but was very good at accommodating the opinions of others, and a great political image manager, and is really famous for maintaining the outward forms and the facade of the Republic, even as he was renovating and changing the Constitution into a more autocratic, more monarchical kind of model, which is something that Julius Caesar might have aimed at doing, but didn't really care enough about accommodating public opinion to pull it off, or at least accommodating elite opinion. There's this great, I want to say that this is in Suetonius, who's a biographer of the 12 Caesars, the first 12 emperors. And one of these great anecdotes, this comparison, is that occasionally Caesar and Octavian, as sort of the head political figures, would have to go to the athletic games and things like races or gladiator fights or what have you. And Caesar thought this was a total waste of time, and he would spend his time in there kind of writing letters and doing other business. And when people saw that, they kind of found it a little alienating, because he wasn't like showing that he was one of the common folk. So when Octavian did the same thing and he went, he would always make sure that it looked like he was paying attention and he was kind of cheering along and participating, even though he probably had the same opinions. And that's just sort of who knows if this is an apocryphal thing or if it actually happened. But I think the reason it's a good story is it does really kind of capture something important about the difference in character, that Julius Caesar being someone without a lot of patience for other people's BS, and Octavian someone who could at least feign that kind of patience.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Dan Carlin mentions in Hardcore History, is that Octavian, so pretty much with I forget who it was, but the people who wanted to do the land reforms, the guy, I'm not sure their name, Gracius or something like that.
Gracchus,
Gracchus. Yeah. So then they got killed. Then his brother came up. He ends up having to run away and kill himself. And then sort of Caesar learned from both of them, and then put into place something, I'm not sure if it was similar or something along those lines. And then he ends up dying as well. And then Octavian learned from that and took into account that you need to, even if people don't actually have power, they need to feel like they have some sort of power. So like the Roman kind of higher ups, they need to be able to, even though they only have power in title, they want to be able to feel that, so that they don't kind of schedule a mutiny type thing or plan something out like that. And so the thing that Octavian put into place, was that the empire kind of thing, where we had the Roman emperors from that point on, or?
Well, a lot of people refer to it as the Principate, because one of the titles that Octavian used for himself was princeps, which kind of goes to your point about this, being kind of keeping the facade in place. Princeps is kind of translated as first citizen, or just kind of the first person. And this is kind of what we were playing on. We came up with Rome's last citizen for Cato. So one neat thing is that's where the word prince comes from, but it originally just kind of meant not royalty, but just kind of the first person. There is a title before that of the princeps senatus, was kind of the first member of the Senate, was sort of the oldest or most prestigious member of the Senate. And Octavian just kind of refers to himself as the princeps, to symbolize that he was kind of the leading man, but just the first among equals, not the ruler or anything. So later on, so for the first couple of hundred years, the Roman emperors refer to themselves with titles like princeps. Later on, when the empire becomes even more autocratic and more power gets centralized in the emperor, people start referring to the emperor as dominus, or lord. But that's sort of a new development. Mm-hmm. So people kind of use principate to talk about this period in sort of the early imperial period, where you have a ruler, but he's still sort of maintaining this idea that it's kind of outwardly a republic, and there's a Senate and he listens to them, and so on. The other reason that I like that term better than empire is it kind of helps you avoid confusing how Rome itself was governed with the way that it governed its territories and provinces. So, even when Rome was a republic, it was an empire, and that it was trying to govern in an imperial way other peoples and other territories, kind of in the way that in the heyday of the British Empire in the 19th century, Britain is a democracy, or at least kind of a parliamentary government at home for its own people, but it's an empire abroad. So, when you're referring to the British Empire, you're kind of being clear that you're talking about its territories overseas. But sometimes when people say the Roman Empire, they overlook the fact that Rome, even when it has a republic and has elections and has a functional senate, is still governing other territories as an empire to them. So that part didn't really change. Like, it didn't really matter if you were out in the provinces, like if you were in Spain or Gaul or Africa. If Rome was an empire or republic, in fact, things might have gotten better for you under the Principate, because the people that were sent out to govern you, might be people that were selected for their competence by the emperor, rather than people who were just trying to kind of make a buck and use that money to kind of compete for political preeminence back at Rome. So what this transition looked like, the transition from a republic to rule by the imperial household, would have looked different depending on where you sat. Part of the issue is all this kind of text and the sort of all these laments about the decline of the republic, written from the perspective of senatorial elites, of people who are in the Senate, who occupy these predominant positions in the republic and no longer have them. And of course, that's why the loss of the republic is a huge tragedy for them and for people who follow after them and read what they wrote. But we have to speculate a little bit more about what this would have looked like to the man or woman in the street, or the man or woman in the provinces. And that's a little bit harder to say, of course, because there's less evidence.
We don't really have any information on sort of like all this political infighting that's going on like during in the upper elite, but we don't know what does that translate to like the simple people, right? Like the people who aren't involved in that at all. Like, do they care who wins or loses?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, in that, Caesar thought of himself and kind of marketed himself as a popularis, as a man of the people who would do things like land redistribution of the kind that was associated with the Gracchi, and said that he was going to war to protect the people's rights, even as he's establishing a dictatorship. But as to how actual life would have changed, I think that's kind of where you start getting into things like, like physical archaeology, and recovering the physical evidence, and doing things like reading inscriptions and reading graffiti. Just because the textual evidence that we have is so biased to the elite sources. I think one guy whose podcast I love is Patrick Wyman's. I listen to all his Tides of History podcasts. And he hasn't really talked about this period, but he has talked about how the techniques we have in learning about the physical remains of the past, our ability to do DNA testing and radiocarbon dating, and all these techniques of physical archaeology have gotten so much better and more sophisticated in the last generations, that you can do things like, if you can discover prehistoric remains, and you can actually study people's the composition of their teeth enamel and their bones, and you can tell about what kind of food they've been eating and where it came from and what their diet was made of and what kind of standard of living they would have had. So I think that's the kind of thing you need more of if you wanted to understand what this transition looked like on the ground. Or you need to look at things like building. Were places in the provinces, for instance, like in Libya, which was kind of a big economic center in the Roman Empire, were they able to build more after this transition or less? What was their economy like? Were there more coins in circulation? Were people shipping more grain back and forth? What are the records in the warehouses look like? And all this stuff, I'm not an expert in that by any means, but all that stuff is the kind of evidence you need to look at to think about what this transition looks like, to people who didn't leave a written record. For people who did leave a written record, people like Plutarch, or in Rome itself, people like Livy or Sallust or Tacitus. They all have different takes on this history and what actually happened, and if this change was for the better or for the worse. But they're all writing from the perspective of the sort of the 1% of their day. So they write oftentimes in theoretical terms about what's happening, and they do political theory, and they talk about virtue and institutions and constitutions, and that's all valid and really interesting. But you also always have to keep in mind where they're coming from and what matters to them, what their priorities are, and that's just part of taking all the sources we read with a grain of salt.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the one of the things actually I wanted to get your opinion on is how much how aware are you of Marcus Aurelius and some of the things that he did? Because I picked up Cato because I was interested in his philosophy. You know, I didn't even know he was a statesman or anything like that. And so how well versed are you in sort of later republic where they had emperors and about Marcus Aurelius?
Yeah, I know a little bit of that period. You mentioned Ryan Holiday in the Lives of the Stoics. So I've talked to him a little bit. I've read his stuff. I've worked with him just a little bit on some of the stuff in this period. And Marcus Aurelius is such a fascinating figure in the later in the later Principate. But that's not something that I've written about myself or learned a lot about myself, other than kind of doing a cursory read of things like Meditations and the other stuff around his period. But for people like Marcus Aurelius, Cato was sort of a really pivotal and um, fascinating figure, both because Cato set the standard of what it meant to be a Roman Stoic, and because he kind of set this pattern, some of which was based on actual events, some of which was kind of the mythology that builds up around any extraordinary person, but set this pattern of what it was like to live a life that was in politics and power, but also a Stoic life, a life that looked like a life of integrity. And this was something that was really, was one of the main ways that Cato's legacy lived on, was how later Roman Stoics like Marcus Aurelius thought about him.
You think Cato would have been as well remembered if he had just kind of accepted Caesar's reign and kind of lived with his family and things like that? Or do you think that him ending his life in the brutal way that he did, that was one of the most crazy suicides, like sounds miserable, like a horrible way to go. But do you think he would have lived on in the memory of all these people, George Washington? Would there have been plays about him and things like that had he just not taken his life? Or do you think that was an integral part of kind of the myth of him?
Yeah, that's hard to say, but I do think that things like dramatic deaths and kind of iconic moments are so big in shaping historical memory. I think that's always been the historical memory of Cato. I think if he hadn't sort of ended his life in this sort of dramatic gesture that people argued about and fought over, really from the moment that it happened, um, um, yeah, I don't think he would be remembered in the same kind of dramatic way. I think you'd still have his political record and the examples he left behind. Um, no, but I think, to the extent that he was very aware of the fact that he was creating a spectacle of himself, that he was doing something in public for public consumption, like most of his life would have been. I think that's a real kind of recognition that so much of politics is spectacle, and that shapes how we remember and think about politics. Just think about in the context of U.S. politics. Um, would JFK be remembered in the same way if he hadn't been assassinated? Things like death and bloodshed have a really good way of searing themselves into historical memory. And like I said, this is something that happens in Cato's case. Right. Almost immediately. Again, this is from Plutarch, so I think so. We can't say to what extent this is mythological or was based on something that actually happened, but it might have been in the sources. Is the idea that after Caesar is celebrating a triumph after the Civil War is concluded, and Roman triumphs would kind of include these things like parade floats. They'd have kind of big physical models of of the things that had happened during the campaign and the cities they'd conquered and the battles they'd won and so on. And one of the displays was a sort of big, larger than life picture of Cato killing himself and kind of ripping out his intestines in the bloody way he did. And of course, Romans had a big taste for bloodshed and gore, so you can imagine. And this supposedly was something that the crowd kind of booed and reacted really badly against. That this was someone that they sympathized with, even though he hadn't necessarily been on their side, and they didn't like the idea of Caesar exploiting it for politics. But also Caesar felt the need to kind of deal with it and thought that it could be exploited for politics. So my point is that this is something from the very beginning, right in the kind of immediate aftermath, that people were struggling over and thinking about, and really put Cato in the public eye in a lasting way. So no, I don't think his legacy would be the same if that hadn't been part of the story.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned was, how they did during triumphs. They would show paintings of their kind of fallen victims and things like that. And it actually reminded me of, I'm not sure how big of a music fan you are, but there's like a genre of music called drill rap in Chicago where it's just gang wars, and they're gangsters who are also rappers, and they will like murder the people on the other side and then make songs about it. And it's kind of a problematic aspect of rap music because these guys are just killing each other and then like talking about it in songs and like insulting the dead and things like that. And I felt it was an interesting kind of like it's still going, like it was going on back then and it's still going on kind of today as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's sort of a universal, is the idea that death and bloodshed are compelling. They're what people make stories about and have always been telling. So one of the things that people have always told stories about, and I think that's part of what the story, the lessons of learning about Cato and politics is learning just about how important story and narrative and image are in politics in a way that seems so completely modern, even though it was so long ago.
Yeah, and about Cicero, this is a big focus on your latest book. What made him such a powerful orator?
A good question. Well, I think one is that you have to think about the culture that he came up in. This is someone in a culture in which public speech is so important to the career development of someone who wants to be a member of the elite. It's valued, it's taught, it's consumed. That there are huge public crowds that make something like a speech at a trial or to a political assembly, a big public spectacle and a moment of interest and something that you can learn from. There are kind of informal mentoring systems in which people who wanted a career in the forum as some kind of public advocate or political figure would attach themselves to someone they had a family connection with or a political connection with and follow them around and watch their performances and learn from them. And Cicero writes really movingly about some of the older people in the generation before him that he learned the tricks of the trade from. On top of that, he put in a lot of extra study. He describes in one of his kind of autobiographical moments having this sort of physical or nervous breakdown because he's pushing himself too hard. And taking some time off away from Rome to go study in Rhodes, an island in Greece that had a really famous and successful school of oratory, where he would learn both in Greek and Latin some more tricks of the trade. So he's someone that put a tremendous amount of focus and time and effort into it, but also someone in a culture who really kind of rewarded those things. So he certainly wasn't the only one, but he was someone who was really successful within that culture. And if you read his work on the history of Roman oratory, there's especially one that's addressed to his friend and colleague Brutus, who's the guy who later on goes to participate in the assassination of Caesar. He writes about all these Roman orators from the past and these figures from Roman history that we don't really know much about. We don't really have records of what they said, but he's someone with an encyclopedic memory and knowledge of the highlights of this one particular practice, this art of oratory in Latin, going back many centuries and many generations. So he's someone who is kind of immersed in this culture and takes it, it's just sort of his calling and takes it very seriously, but also is kind of supported by the fact that there's a tremendous network and public spectacle around this one particular thing that gives him both the opportunity and the rewards for being really good at it.
Yeah, as well. I liked what you mentioned about in your latest book, from what I have read of it, how sort of rhetoric, one of the important parts of it is you go out and put yourself in public and you say what you think people want to hear. You kind of put yourself at risk, and then you learn what they want via talking, And so there's kind of, I'm not sure if you've read Skin in the Game by Nassim Taleb, but he talks about that as well a lot. Have you read that book? Yeah.
I haven't read it, but I've know some of the stuff he's written, so I think that kind of jives what you're talking about.
Yeah. So pretty much it's sort of the good part about it is you're putting something at risk in order to get that information. So it's kind of like a give and take in terms of that rhetoric aspect of it.
Yeah, no, I think so. So one of the things I talk about is this idea that what makes rhetoric powerful is this idea that the speaker and audience are both putting something on the line. They both have skin in the game. The audience, you're taking a risk when you listen to someone who challenges your beliefs and might change your mind, which can be we were just talking about that, how the beliefs that you hold are a real integral part of who you are, how you think of yourself in the world. That's a risk. But speakers, people like Cicero, take big risks too, specifically the risk that they can try to persuade someone, try to win a crowd over, just get it wrong, can be rejected, can have things go very badly and face kind of humiliation or this public loss of face, which, especially in the Roman context, with sort of this honor-based culture, is a tremendously big deal for someone like Cicero. So it's this idea of both sides putting skin in the game and both sides in this situation taking on risks and exposing themselves to vulnerabilities that in some sense levels the playing field between the speaker and the audience, and in some sense makes rhetoric a little bit more fair than it might otherwise be. Because again, it's an elite activity. It's something that few people do and lots of people listen to. Cicero wasn't any kind of Democrat. He wasn't any kind of person who believed in democracy or the wisdom of crowds in general. But one thing that interested me in this book is the way in which he's pushed just a little bit in that direction by his engagement with crowds. He was not really someone who thought the crowds were tremendously wise or smart, but he still had to know them and engage with them and take them seriously if you wanted to be good at his job. Which is something that he put more, study and focus into than really any kind of contemporary.
And so this is something as well in terms of crowds. And when you're crafting a speech, do you have to take into account that sort of the total IQ of the crowd is going to be sort of the lowest person, like the person with the lowest IQ is going to be like the average IQ, like it just kind of gets dumber the bigger people are? Do you think there's like some truth to this, or?
Well, there are different kind of schools of thought on it. One is, this idea that something about being in a crowd or being in a crowd that's not, that's discussing something that's kind of at a remove from your ordinary life in politics, kind of lowers people's IQ. There's this line from the Federalist Papers, and I think I'm paraphrasing it, but I think that the writers of the Federalists say that even if in ancient Athens every member of the crowd had been Socrates, it still would have been a mob. You can put the wisest people together, and they will function like a mob simply by virtue of being a lot of them in a public space. On the other hand, there's a lot of literature on the wisdom of crowds. The idea that when you put a bunch of people together, each person knows a little bit of a problem, and they can aggregate what they know of the problem together to make better collective decisions. Because I might not know the whole thing, and you might not know the whole thing, but together we can combine our knowledge and figure it out if we have a good process for aggregating and putting our knowledges together. So this is a big debate. It's not a resolved one. It goes way, way, way back in history, and I don't have a good answer to it other than I think what rhetoric is about, or one of the things it's about, is thinking of ways to activate the good side of the equation, to think about ways to activate public judgment and help crowds do better. Because, for better or worse, there are often or even always going to be large groups of people in politics. This is just part of the nature of politics. So if that's going to exist, then people who study and think about and practice rhetoric need to think about the ways of better activating people's judgment and helping people in big groups judge, rather than hindering them. And that's the hard thing.
Yeah, and another thing that I found I find quite frustrating is I like to see kind of both sides of different arguments and hear kind of the positives and the negatives of certain things, right? But then when I see these political speeches, it's kind of just the most basic possible, like it's boiled down to the most basic possible answer. So I guess sort of an example would be Obama's entire slogan, which is change. And that's it, so it's all kind of just very simplified. And I guess the question here is, how is it possible to have like a nuanced take in politics, or?
Well, I think the thing about change is it's one of the things that's designed to be all things to all people. Like, no matter where you are in politics, you probably want something to change. So that's something you can kind of get behind. And that's what politicians think about. They think about the slogan that kind of, offend the fewest number of people and cast the biggest possible net, to attract people into it. But, what helps people actually judge and kind of, receive nuance, I think part of it is speaking across disagreement, and speaking to large groups that may or may not agree with you. And I don't want to kind of paint some kind of rosy picture of back in the day when everything used to be bipartisan and people got along, because certainly that wasn't the case. But I do think that speaking to people with the expectation that you're going to make an argument and that you're going to win people over who may or may not be skeptical, versus you're just going to kind of rally and mobilize the people that are probably already primed to agree with you. I think the former makes rhetoric more, rewarding and interesting and challenging and nuanced because you actually have to convince people. And then you have to think about the ways in which people are responsible for the decisions they're going to make. So when I think about, when rhetoric is successful and when it isn't, you have to think about what's going on in the political situation. You have to think about the kind of places where you hear it, who gets spoken to, who decides who's in the crowd, what decisions do people actually get to make. One thing that a lot of political theorists talk about is the way in which most people participate in politics is in a really kind of limited way. Even in Rome, which was not a democracy, you still had public assemblies that were listening to proposals and voting on them, and were exercising in some ways kind of direct power. Much of what we do in a modern representative democracy, which is kind of on the borderline of democracy or not, is that you get to choose who's going to govern you. You pick who you want, which set of elites are going to govern, and which sets elites are going to rule, and who's going to not. But that's a really kind of disengaged role for the public to play compared to periods in which kind of rhetoric has flourished more. So, part of it is if there's no expectation you're really going to be persuading and winning over the public because their role is to be so disengaged, I don't think you're going to see the more sophisticated and nuanced forms of rhetoric develop because there isn't much of a need for that. So I guess what I try to say in the book is a lot of what we can learn about eloquence and rhetoric comes from the politics that are surrounding it, comes from the institutions where it's practiced and the ways that people practice it. The subtitle of the book, and this is the title of the dissertation that started off as, but I started as something called Eloquence and Its Conditions. As still the subtitle, the idea being that eloquence isn't just a thing that some people have. It goes along with certain political conditions. There are certain conditions that help it flourish and certain conditions that tend to stamp it out. And if you're interested in that, you should learn about when it flourishes and when it doesn't. But you can also learn a lot about the kind of politics of your time and where you are by treating the kind of speech that happens as sort of a leading indicator. It tells you a lot about where you are politically if you learn about how politics sounds. And, at least that's kind of the case I try to make in this book.
Yeah, and it sounds very interesting, and I will get to this book for sure. Like, I love I love politics and I love speeches. And so, yeah, it's a perfect little niche that you made with this book. So I'm excited to dip into it.
Yeah, thanks.
And, I guess if you were to get into politics today, or if you had advice for someone getting into politics, what would you say, like, where would be a good place to start? What kind of messaging would you recommend someone who's sort of just grassroots trying to kind of get in their local community? What would you say is a good approach to take?
Well, yeah, I'd say that just what you described is important. I think that there's part of the problem is I think politics is really nationalized, which means you're kind of dealing with a lot of abstractions that don't kind of really directly affect people's lives in a really concrete way, and also don't kind of bring you into contact with the people you're going to have to be living with when you make these decisions. So I say, as you suggest, figure out what you can do at a local level. Figure out if there's a school board or a board of elections or a planning board or a zoning board that needs people on it, because I think these are places that have real day-to-day consequences for the people that make those decisions and live with those decisions. And two, it's not to say that things there can't get heated and out of control and polarized, but I also think that there's this sort of this idea of having to live with the consequences in a really direct way kind of has a really kind of responsibility producing effect, because you just got to deal with it because you're going to be there in the immediate community making those decisions. And I don't know if there's a particular opportunity for eloquence in those sort of places as it connects to rhetoric. But I do think that to the extent that you're put into contact with people that you might have big disagreements with, that there's got to be persuasion happening, which is sort of the foundation of eloquence. You have to actually you have to talk to people and win them over. I think about I live in Toronto, and one of the big issues here, as it is in lots of cities, is stuff about walkability and bikeability versus car infrastructure. And there are lots of fights about this, but it's a day-to-day impact on how people live their lives. And I think you also find that you're living side by side with people who might have a completely different view on whether it's better to build a bike lane or not. my wife before COVID was at a meeting, sort of public meeting that she just went to as a kind of spectator and participant about whether to put a bike lane in on one of Toronto's busier streets on the east side called the Danforth. And there was a really there's a lot of there's a lot of vitriol. There's a lot of people angry that they were taking away space for cars to put in bikes, and a lot of people who rode bikes that are angry about getting hit by cars or being threatened by cars. So it's not to say like these things can't get heated, but I do think that people can kind of see something concrete coming out of their efforts. And I don't think it's necessarily any more heated than national politics, which has had this kind of abstract kind of culture war vibe. This is about making a real on the ground decision. And, they ended up putting the bike lane in mainly because of COVID. They were trying to encourage people to get out and exercise more. So they put it in, and I think it's been a big success. But that's the kind of thing that I think, I wish people who, I say this, this applies to me too, because I spend too much time kind of reading, Twitter and political news and national level stuff. I think if people took a little less time to do that and a little more time to figure out, who in your neighborhood is agitating for bike lanes, or who in your neighborhood is agitating for more development, more housing to be built. If you spend more time doing that, I really think that's the way to go.
Yeah, and that's something I found pretty interesting. So I guess it's a political topic, but I'm pretty anti-vaccine mandates. So I'm vaccinated, but I don't think there's a reason to have the mandates. It just doesn't make any sense for me to kind of be like, it's like, then what else is going to get mandated? But I've actually had people like on Twitter say that they hoped I died, just because they assume that I'm unvaccinated from that. Yeah. And it's kind of like, I've been seeing this through this, like I pretty much woke up politically during this pandemic. But I've been seeing this vitriol and this hatred for other groups of people, like unvaccinated or vaccinated. And it's been frustrating to see sort of there's no even attempting to find a middle ground or any common type of thing where we can agree on it,
Yeah. I mean, for instance, I gotta say I disagree with you on that. Like I'm pretty pro-vaccine mandate, but I certainly, and one of the things I like about living in Toronto is it's a pretty highly vaccinated place in which most people seem like they're okay with that. But I certainly don't hope you die. And I think that people are, like talking even on Zoom or face to face is just kind of good for dealing with the fact that like, okay, well, here's someone that kind of shares some stuff with me, like they want to be vaccinated, but they disagree about how to enforce that policy on a national scale. We can talk about it, but it's just like, I think people weren't made to, this is not an original thought at all, but people weren't made to have these arguments with just kind of little squares on social media where you get a couple characters and you kind of win points and you get support by making the worst interpretation of anyone else's argument, and you win engagement by promoting vitriol and anger. Facebook and Twitter and social media companies know that that's what gets people to engage, and they're designed to promote that kind of engagement, which is good for them, but not really good for having an actual argument. And it's frustrating, and who knows how to resolve this. And I don't really write a lot about social media in my book because honestly, I don't know, what rhetoric is going to look like as the age of social media develops, other than kind of enabling people to talk to situations that aren't where they're not kind of, able to persuade and able to be engaged with people that they genuinely disagree with. But I do think that people consume more and more politics content than ever, but they really do kind of relate to it as kind of consumers or fans or spectators, but not really as people who are active decision makers and citizens. And one of the things that a lot of ancient writers on rhetoric talk about, and I get this from Brian Garston, who wrote another great book on rhetoric called Saving Persuasion that I learned a lot from, is that they found that when people have skin in the game, when people are making a actual decision that is going to affect actual lives, that kind of has a responsibility promoting and moderating effect on rhetoric, because they know it's going to enable them to they have to live with the decision they make. They have to live with the results of their choice. And this is sort of it means you can't just be engaged to score points and get likes and get wins and get cheap popularity. It means you have to live with your decision, and you have to live with the words you speak. And I do think that that's more likely to happen on the local level right now than it is on the kind of national level, where everything's just sort of death threats and culture war, and it's very ugly. And people find it addictive, but kind of addictive in a really destructive way.
Yeah, and so I guess the answer would be to get away from social media more and just kind of connect with the community.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that social media can be useful, but I think it's this kind of thing that people need to be so much more deliberate about what they're using it for and how they're using it, and thinking about it as a tool rather than something that kind of uses us. And I wish I had a better. I'm hardly the only person who's uh, had that thought. I think there's a good book by a guy called Richard Seymour from the UK called The Twittering Machine, kind of about the politics of social media and what it does to us. And there's a lot about this. You know, Ross Douthat, I never figured out how to pronounce his last name, but at the New York Times has written about trying to kind of exercise control, democratic control over social media rather than having it kind of control and run our lives. But I do think that's so much of where the future of rhetoric is happening that I wish I had more insight about what to do about that other than thinking about the ways that it's destructive.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting problem that we're going to have to deal with for the coming, like it's not going away, and it seems to just be getting worse. It's like going downhill. It just like keeps gaining momentum.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say that I think is positive, to sort of wrap this part up, is that I think that um, at least people in our generation have grown up with it enough that we kind of are aware of it. We know how to use it. We kind of know the ins and outs. I think comparing ourselves to kind of boomers who are just kind of flooded with this, very relatively late in life, with this whole new way of engaging with media in the world, and had a lot of not obviously not for everyone. There are plenty of boomers who do just fine with social media, but for a lot of them, had some really kind of destructive consequences, or really kind of people getting sucked into scams, people getting politically radicalized in any direction, because it's just a totally new way to relate to media. And I think that at the very least, you can say that kind of from millennials onward, it's something that we take for granted, and we've learned to navigate a little bit better. And I also think about the millennials I know that are raising our kids are a little bit more cautious about how we want our kids to be exposed to it than our parents' generation were, because again, it's all new. We've had a chance to see the effects both on people that we know and people that are older than us, and on kids. So I think there's going to be a little more tendency to be critical of it as our generation keeps raising kids. But who knows? That's my guess.
Yeah, and even just looking at my brother has a son, so I have a little nephew, and they just give him when he's getting too hyper, they just give him a phone, and he just he's like, he becomes a zombie, right? He just
sure.
Into it. And that's even before social media.
Yeah, and not as if we do that to don't do that to our kids. Of course, I think every parent's done that from time to time, so I know how it is. But it's scary to see how these things are designed very deliberately to control and maximize attention, and that's not really a state in which someone, going back to rhetoric, can be a perceptive and sort of judging audience. There's a reason that the things like doom scrolling are a great new turns of phrase for what we do, because that's just it's totally a passive activity. It's just sort of scrolling through and having these feelings of dread and doom wash over you. That's not really engagement. Or people do rage scrolling. They have feelings of anger wash over them. But all these things kind of make you into a passive kind of consumer or spectator, not to someone who's got to meet their other citizens and meet their neighbors and figure out what we're going to do about X together and how we're going to act in the face of our big disagreements about stuff.
And so I want to ask a couple more questions and we'll let you go. But the main question, main final question, I guess, what can we take from Cato, going back to Cato, what can we take from Cato and bring that into our lives, whether that's politics or rhetoric?
What can we take from Cato? I guess it's a good one. I guess one thing that I take from Cato is both about the value and the limits of principle, that no one would remember Cato if he'd just been any other kind of Roman senator. There are so many people in his social position, with his background and his class and his political offices, that are just completely forgotten by history because they didn't really make a difference, because they didn't stand out as people who were committed to a set of ideals kind of beyond their own comfort or advancement. But at the same time, that can be taken too far, because Cato was someone who lived and talked as if the thing that he valued above all was the Republic and Mos Maiorum, the way of the elders, the way of the ancients. But the results of his conduct were actually destructive of those things that he claimed to and probably did value more than anything else. So there's not an easy answer to this. Is why politics is hard. This is why there are people who spend their lives studying this and people spend their lives practicing it. But it's how to figure out in every kind of action and choice we make, how to balance a commitment to something that is so important and so valuable, whatever that is to us, with the fact that we are thrown together with a bunch of people who don't agree with us about those things, whatever they are, and how we're going to navigate the real messy world we live in, while still trying to kind of keep some semblance of idealism and principle in our lives. And Cato's someone who really puts that dilemma so clearly. I'm not sure if he can be counted as a success just because of the way his life and career ended, but he's someone who certainly tried and certainly left a really, inspirational and compelling image of what it looks like to face up to that problem. So that's the thing I take from him more than anyone else.
And how about Cicero? What can we take from the rhetoric of Cicero, the life of Cicero? What would you say would be like one of the main takeaways for him?
Yeah, good question. I think for Cicero, one of the things that I take from him is the way in which, the ways he practiced rhetoric were a lot different from the ways he thought about rhetoric. He thought about things like risk and exposing yourself to the judgment of the audience and vulnerability and putting yourself out there in a way that could cause you to lose face. That's not always how he spoke and acted. He often talked about rhetoric and thought about rhetoric as if it was a much kind of riskier, more daring thing than it actually was, because he was a cautious politician in his own way. So I think for him the lesson is kind of, the idea, it's similar to this lesson about Cato, about the tension between idealism and real life, except kind of in the different direction here. And I think for Cicero, he was someone who kind of imagined a higher set of ideals that he was always capable of living up to. But those ideals that he thought of and that he wrote about so movingly and compellingly are still a really important part of his legacy, even if he didn't kind of live them out in practice. And they're still the things that people like me study, thousands and thousands of years later. So I think it's sort of a similar, I hadn't really thought about it before you asked that question, but I think that it's a similar kind of, problem. It's how do you come up with valuable and compelling political ideals and then live by them? So if Cato was someone who lived by his ideals so much that he damaged his ideals, Cicero is almost someone who came up with a great set of ideals and didn't really live by them, but also thought about them and wrote about them in a really compelling and interesting way that still holds our interest now. So I think they're both dealing with a similar problem, even though they kind of lived out different solutions to it.
Yeah, and actually one of the interesting things about Cicero that I found, and I'm not sure if this is true, but I feel when he was writing these letters, and since we have such a kind of a breadth of information from Cicero, I feel like he knew that this stuff would be passed along from generations and generations, and he was like consciously sure to, maintain and keep some of these things for after he was gone, so that he would be kind of remembered throughout the times.
Yeah, that's very true. Is that this is someone who very much had an eye to posterity, who very much wanted to be remembered and celebrated and honored. That's why he wrote down his speeches and had them copied out and distributed. That's why he wrote philosophy and wrote these letters and made sure they weren't just kind of personal notes. He made sure that there were lots of copies that were saved very carefully and collected after his death. So both him and Cato, in different ways, very much had an eye on creating these historical memories and afterlives. That's kind of another lesson, is I think that historical memories of people don't just happen. Sometimes they do, I guess. But for someone, for I think a lot more of the time, it's because the people who we remember took a lot of steps to consciously create those memories. Really, they wanted to be remembered and thought about how they would be remembered and tried to shape an image that would go down in time. Which means, one, when you think about those images, be critical of them because they were created by very canny and effective politicians to shape the way we think about them. But two, it also means that to the extent that we want to be remembered, that we want to do something memorable, that it's not just a thing that happens by chance. It's always a deliberate thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Yeah, thanks. It was a pleasure to have this talk. I really appreciate it.
Tell the listeners where about your books a little bit and where they can get them.
Yeah, so my most recent book is called Words on Fire, Eloquence and Its Conditions. You can get it on Amazon. It was published by Cambridge University Press a few weeks ago, but you can get it on Amazon or anywhere you buy your books. And that I wrote myself, and I've co-written 2 books with Jimmy Soni. One is Rome's Last Citizen, which we just talked about, which is a book about Cato. And there's another book that Jimmy and I co-wrote called A Mind at Play, which is a totally different book. It's about Claude Shannon, who's the founder of information theory, who's sort of one of the most influential computer scientists and mathematicians in the mid 20th century. We said when we were talking about this book, he's the reason we can have this conversation over the internet right now. He laid the groundwork for all that, so I don't need to get into that. But totally different book. But I've really enjoyed writing and learning about all these cool people from history, and it's been a privilege to be able to do it. So I hope you're interested in some of them, but especially this most recent one that I'm very proud of. Talks a lot about the history of rhetoric from ancient times to the present, and what rhetoric is like today, and what's wrong with political rhetoric today, and how we might fix it a little bit.
Yeah, and I've started it, and I'm liking what I'm reading so far. But yeah, what I'm very grateful that you took the time to write was Rome's Last Citizen. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much.
That's that's something that I hope you can look at and be like, that was a very good contribution to the world. I'm sure Words on Fire is as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And Rob, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks.